"Sir, I don't think you understand how financing works here." The sales manager said it loud enough that 3 other customers browsing the showroom floor turned to look. Warren Hicks stood near the service counter of Midtown Auto Group with his 10-year-old daughter, Zaria, beside him, a folder of paperwork in his hand, having just asked to see the financing options on a used sedan priced at $14,000. He wore a plain flannel shirt, jeans, work boots with dried concrete dust still crusted along the soles, and the manager, a man named Curtis Reyes, had looked him over once and decided the conversation was already finished. "You'd probably do better at a buy here, pay here lot a few miles east," Curtis said, not quite looking at Warren, addressing the space slightly to his left. "Something more in your range." Zaria looked up at her father, then at the man who had just dismissed him in front of strangers, and said nothing, because she had learned, at 10 years old, that some silences were the loudest thing in a room. What happened over the next half hour would end with Curtis standing in the middle of his own showroom, with no argument left. A mechanic walking out from the service bay who recognized Warren's face from a hospital hallway 6 years earlier, and every customer in that dealership learning exactly who they had just watched get turned away. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there's more coming. Warren Hicks had spent 6 years rebuilding a life that had come apart all at once, and he had done it the only way he knew how, one steady day at a time. He worked as a concrete foreman for a commercial contractor, 6 days a week during pour season, and he had raised Zaria alone since her mother's death from an aggressive cancer that had moved through her body faster than any of the specialists had predicted. He was 37. Lean and weathered in the way of a man who spent most of his working hours outdoors, with a quiet, watchful manner that made people assume, incorrectly, that there was not much happening behind his eyes. He did not talk about the years before the concrete job, the 9 he had spent in the Air Force, 6 of those as a pararescueman, the kind of work that put him on helicopters over open water and hostile terrain to pull people out of situations most of them did not survive without him. He had left the service 2 years before his wife's diagnosis, worn down by a body that had absorbed more impact than it was built to carry. And he had spent the years since building a life defined less by what he had once done, and more by what he did every single evening, which was show up, cook dinner, check homework, and make sure his daughter never once doubted that she was the center of what remained of his world. Their house was small, a rented 2-bedroom on a quiet street where Warren had learned the names of every neighbor within the first month, mostly out of habit from a career that had taught him to know his surroundings without thinking about it. He kept his old service gear in a footlocker in the closet, rarely opened, not out of shame, but because he had made a conscious decision, the year his wife got sick, that the man he had been overseas needed to make room for the man his daughter actually needed at home, and he had never found a reason to revisit that decision. He coached Zariah's rec league soccer team in the fall, not because he understood soccer particularly well, but because the previous coach had quit mid-season and nobody else had stepped up, and Zaria had cried the day he agreed to do it, though she would not admit to that now. He kept a single photograph of his wife on the nightstand, and he talked to Zaria about her often, deliberately, because he had decided early that grief handled honestly was better for a child than grief avoided out of some misguided instinct to protect her from sadness altogether. Zaria was quiet, in the particular way of a child who had grown up faster than her age suggested, watchful, precise with her words, carrying a folder of her own report cards in her backpack because she liked organizing things the way her father organized his tools. She had asked, 3 weeks earlier, whether they could get a car that was actually theirs, instead of the 15-year-old truck Warren drove that occasionally needed to be started with a specific sequence of steps only he fully understood. Warren had been saving toward exactly that for the better part of a year, careful about it, the way he was careful about most things since Zaria's mother passed, because a single income covering 2 lives left very little room for mistakes. He had researched used sedans for weeks, settled on a model with a strong reliability record, and driven them both to Midtown Auto Group on a Saturday morning because their online listing showed a $14,000 sedan with low mileage that fit exactly what he had saved for. They arrived a little after 10, the showroom bright and busy with the particular energy of a dealership on a weekend, salespeople moving between customers with practiced enthusiasm, the smell of new tire rubber and fresh carpet hanging in the air. A young salesman greeted them near the entrance, took down the vehicle they were interested in, and walked them out to the lot to look at it, friendly enough in the way of someone working on commission and unsure yet which direction this particular sale was going to go. Warren inspected the car carefully, checked the tires, the interior, asked about the maintenance history, and told the salesman he was ready to move forward with financing. The salesman, checking with his manager as dealership policy required for any transaction over a certain amount, brought Curtis Reyes out from his office, and it was in that walk back inside that everything shifted. Curtis looked Warren over the moment he stepped behind the financing desk, took in the flannel shirt, the concrete dust on his boots, the absence of a wedding ring, the 10-year-old standing quietly beside him, and made a series of assumptions in under 10 seconds that he would spend the next 20 minutes acting on as though they were established fact. He had worked at Midtown Auto Group for 9 years, long enough to develop a set of private, unspoken rules about which customers were worth his full attention and which ones he could move through quickly. Rules he had never once questioned because nobody in his position had ever asked him to. "What's your current income situation?" he asked, before Warren had even finished sitting down, his tone carrying the particular flatness of a man who had already decided the answer would not be good enough. Warren told him calmly that he worked full-time as a foreman, provided his pay stubs without being asked twice, and mentioned that he had a down payment ready to reduce the loan amount significantly. Curtis flipped through the documents without much interest and said, "I'm just going to be honest with you. Financing at this dealership tends to favor buyers with a bit more established credit history." Warren asked what specifically about his credit history was the concern, since he had not yet run a credit check. Curtis did not have a specific answer, because there wasn't one yet. Only the accumulated weight of a judgment formed before any actual numbers had been reviewed. "You'd probably do better at a buy here, pay here lot a few miles east," Curtis said, not quite looking at Warren, addressing the space slightly to his left. "Something more in your range." The sentence landed with a particular weight in the quiet financing office, and Warren felt Zariah go still beside him, her hand finding the edge of his sleeve. He did not raise his voice. "I haven't given you a reason to say that," he said. "I gave you documentation. I have a down payment. I'd like you to actually run the numbers instead of guessing at what I can afford, based on what I'm wearing." Curtis's expression tightened slightly, the look of a man unaccustomed to being corrected by someone he had already dismissed. "I deal with a lot of customers," he said. "I have a sense of these things." Warren looked at him steadily. "A sense isn't a credit report," he said. Zaria, who had been sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap, looked up at Curtis with the direct, unguarded attention of a child who had not yet learned to disguise what she was thinking. "Why don't you want to check?" she asked. Her voice was small, but clear enough to carry across the office. Curtis, visibly caught off guard by being addressed directly by a 10-year-old, offered a thin, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. "It's complicated, sweetheart," he said. Zaria did not look convinced, and did not look away either, which seemed to unsettle Curtis more than anything Warren himself had said so far. At the desk beside them, a younger sales associate named Priya had stopped filling out paperwork and was watching the exchange with obvious discomfort, glancing occasionally toward the showroom floor, where two other customers had drifted closer, drawn by the tension without quite understanding its source yet. An older man test-driving a truck nearby paused near the doorway, his attention caught by the particular stillness in Warren's posture, the kind that suggested restraint rather than resignation. "I'd like you to just run the application," Warren said again, evenly. "If the numbers don't work, I'll accept that." but I want an actual answer, not an assumption." Curtis exhaled with visible irritation, pulled the paperwork toward him, and typed Warren's information into the system with the deliberate slowness of a man performing compliance rather than actually engaging in it. A woman standing near the parts counter, waiting on an unrelated repair estimate, had also drifted closer, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to something more pointed as she caught the tail end of Curtis's comment about the buy here, pay here lot. She glanced at Zaria, still sitting quietly with her hands folded, and something about the sight of a child watching an adult get dismissed so casually seemed to settle any hesitation she had about whether this was any of her business. She did not say anything yet, but she took out her phone and began recording, quietly, angling it low so as not to draw immediate attention, the instinct of someone who had learned that some moments deserved a record even before anyone knew how they would end. The credit check came back within a few minutes, and the numbers on the screen were, by any reasonable dealership standard, solid. A credit score well above the threshold Curtis had implied moments earlier, a debt-to-income ratio that easily supported the loan amount. Curtis stared at the screen for a moment longer than the information required, the particular pause of a man recalibrating a story he had already told himself. He did not apologize. Instead, he said, "Well, this actually looks workable," in a tone that suggested surprise rather than correction, as though the numbers themselves were the anomaly rather than his own assumptions about the man sitting across from him. Warren said nothing for a moment, absorbing the specific insult buried inside a sentence that was technically good news. "This actually looks workable," he repeated slowly, "meaning you didn't expect it to." Curtis did not answer that directly, which told Warren everything the silence needed to. "I'd like to know why you were prepared to send me to another dealership before you ran a single number," Warren said. Curtis's jaw tightened. "I deal with a lot of walk-ins who aren't serious buyers," he said. "I was trying to save everyone time." Warren looked at him for a long moment. "You weren't trying to save time," he said. "You looked at my clothes and decided what I could afford before I opened my mouth. That's not efficiency. That's a decision you made, and you made it in front of my daughter." Curtis, apparently unwilling to simply let the matter rest, attempted a different angle. "Look," he said, glancing briefly at Priya, as though inviting her agreement, which she pointedly did not offer. "We get people in here every week who waste an hour of our time only to walk away, because they never had realistic financing in the first place. I have to make judgment calls." Warren asked him, directly, whether those judgment calls were typically based on anything other than appearance. Curtis did not answer, and the silence stretched long enough that even the salesman who had originally walked them out to the lot, standing a few feet away with a clipboard he no longer seemed to need, looked distinctly uncomfortable on his manager's behalf. The older man near the doorway, who had been quietly observing the exchange for several minutes, stepped closer and spoke up without being asked. "I heard the whole thing," he said, addressing Curtis directly. "This man asked you to run his application and you tried to talk him out of even applying. I bought 4 cars from this dealership over the years. I don't think I've ever seen that happen to anyone who walked in wearing a suit." Curtis glanced at him with visible irritation. "This isn't your conversation," he said. The man did not back down. "I'm a customer standing in your showroom watching how you treat people," he said. "That makes it exactly my business." Priya, still seated nearby, had gone very quiet, her eyes fixed on her own paperwork, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to contradict her manager directly in front of him. Zaria tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said quietly, "are we still getting the car?" Warren crouched slightly to meet her eyes, kept his voice warm and even, the voice reserved specifically for keeping the day's unfairness from becoming her burden to carry. "If the numbers work, we're getting the car, baby," he said. "This isn't about whether we can. It's about how we got treated on the way there, and I want you to see both parts clearly." Zaria nodded, filing the distinction away, with the seriousness she brought to most things her father told her, though her eyes kept drifting toward Curtis with the wary attention of a child assessing something she did not yet have full words for. It was at this point that a man in dealership coveralls walked in from the service bay, drawn by one of the technicians who had mentioned in passing that there seemed to be some kind of dispute happening up front, involving a customer with a young daughter. He was in his 50s, gray at the temples, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag, and he stopped near the edge of the financing office when his eyes landed on Warren's face, then dropped briefly to Warren's left forearm, where the sleeve of his flannel had ridden up slightly to reveal the edge of an old scar, pale and irregular, running from wrist toward elbow. Something shifted in the mechanic's expression, a recalibration that had nothing to do with dealership business. "I know you," he said slowly, his voice carrying an uncertainty that made both Warren and Curtis turn toward him. Warren looked at him, searching a face he did not immediately place among the many he had encountered over the years. "6 years ago," the man said, his voice steadier now. "Coastal Memorial Hospital. My son was airlifted in after a boating accident off the point, hypothermic, barely breathing when they pulled him out of the water. There was a rescue swimmer who went in after him a second time when the current pulled him back out before the basket could get down. The whole crew thought they'd lost the recovery window. Water temperature that time of year, you've got maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia becomes something nobody comes back from. And my son had already been in longer than that." Warren felt something shift in his chest, an old memory surfacing before he had consciously reached for it. Fragments of cold water and rotor noise, and a boy's face going slack under his hands. "That was you," the man said. "I saw your face in the hospital hallway for maybe a minute before they moved you to be checked out yourself. You'd torn your arm open on something under the surface, pulling him free, and you were still asking the nurses whether he'd made it before anyone had even looked at your own injury. I never got your name. They wouldn't release information across cases like that. Some policy about operational details on search and rescue personnel. I just knew there was a man out there who'd gone into freezing water twice for a 14-year-old he'd never met. And I've spent 6 years occasionally wondering if I'd ever get the chance to actually say something to him." The showroom around them had gone quiet. Salespeople and customers alike, drawn by the shift in tone, more than the words themselves. Curtis, for the first time since Warren had walked in, had nothing to say. Warren stood very still, the old scar suddenly feeling heavier under his sleeve than it had in years. "Staff Sergeant Warren Hicks," he said quietly. "Para-rescue. Retired 2 years before my wife passed. That was the job, going in when the water or the terrain made it too dangerous for anyone else to try. You do it enough times, it stops feeling like something worth mentioning at dinner parties." The mechanic crossed the remaining distance and gripped Warren's hand with both of his, holding it a moment longer than a simple handshake required. "My son's 20 now," he said, his voice rough. "Graduated last spring. Works construction himself now, actually. Funny enough. He's alive because you didn't stop after the current took him back the first time. I've told people that story for 6 years, without ever having a name to put on the man in it." Curtis stood behind the financing desk, with the particular stillness of a man whose understanding of the last 20 minutes had just been completely restructured. He looked at the credit report still open on his screen, at Warren, at Zaria, who was watching the mechanic with wide, careful eyes, piecing together a version of her father she had never heard described in this much detail. Priya had stopped pretending to work entirely, her hand pressed lightly to her chest. The older man near the doorway was watching with quiet, focused respect, and 2 more customers had drifted close enough to hear everything. "I want this loan processed properly, and I want an explanation for why it almost wasn't," Warren said, turning back to Curtis, his voice still even, still controlled. Curtis, visibly rattled, mentioned something about standard practice for assessing buyer readiness. Warren asked whether that standard practice had involved looking at a single number on a screen before he arrived, or only the clothes he happened to be wearing that morning? Curtis did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. Only the accumulated weight of a decision made the moment he looked at concrete dust on a man's boots and decided what that meant about the rest of him. "I'm sorry," Curtis said finally, the words arriving stiffly, a man unaccustomed to producing them without an audience forcing the issue. Warren looked at him for a long moment. "You should be," he said. "Not because of anything you just heard about me. Because you looked at a man and his daughter standing in front of you with real documentation and decided, before checking a single fact, that we didn't belong in the showroom. That decision would have been wrong no matter who happened to be standing here." Curtis nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested the distinction had actually registered, even if it had taken an unlikely coincidence to make it land. The mechanic, whose name Warren finally learned was Dale Marsh, insisted on personally overseeing the rest of the paperwork, standing beside Warren at the desk, while Curtis processed the loan with considerably more care than he had shown at any earlier point in the transaction. Dale crouched down to speak with Zaria, while the final documents printed. "Your dad's a hero, you know that," he said gently. She nodded slowly, filing the words away with the seriousness she brought to most things. "I knew he used to jump out of helicopters," she said. "I didn't know it was like that." Dale smiled at her. "The bravest thing about him isn't what happened in that water," he said. "It's that he came home afterward and built a whole quiet life around taking care of you, and never once needed anybody to know the rest of it. That takes its own kind of nerve." On the drive home, in the new sedan, Zaria was quiet for a while, working through something in the unhurried way she worked through most things. "Daddy," she said eventually, "why didn't you just tell him who you were right away? It would have stopped faster." Warren glanced at her in the mirror. "Maybe," he said. "But then the lesson he'd have learned was that he was wrong to treat me that way because of what I did years ago, not because it was already wrong before he knew anything about me at all. I want you to understand the difference, because only one of those is actually true." Zaria considered this for a long moment. "So it's not about the rescue stuff," she said slowly. "It's about just treating people right, because they're people." Warren nodded. "That's exactly it," he said. Zaria nodded back, satisfied, and then asked if they could stop for ice cream to celebrate the car. Warren laughed, the sound loosening something in his chest that had been tight since the moment Curtis first looked at his boots and decided what kind of man owned them. He thought about that morning often in the weeks that followed, not with anger, which had never been the feeling he carried longest, but with a plain, clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The dealership's regional owner called him personally the following week, an apology delivered without an audience this time, along with confirmation that staff would be receiving retraining on customer treatment standards, delivered without Warren needing to ask for either. The owner also mentioned, somewhat awkwardly, that the woman who had been recording near the parts counter had posted a short clip of the exchange online, not the confrontation itself, so much as the moment Dale gripped Warren's hand, and that it had been shared considerably more than the dealership was entirely comfortable with. Warren had not asked for that, had not wanted it, and told the owner as much, though he understood there was little to be done about a video already circulating on its own momentum. He accepted the apology, without making more of it than it was. What mattered more to him was quieter than any formal gesture, or any number of views of video accumulated. The fact that his daughter had watched her father hold his ground calmly in a room that had decided to underestimate him, had watched people slowly recognize a truth that should never have needed recognizing in the first place, and had learned, without being told directly, that dignity was not something earned by revealing what he had once done. It was something owed simply for showing up as himself, documentation in hand, asking for nothing more than what he had already worked for. He thought, too, about his wife, and about the version of this story he would have told her that evening if she were still there to hear it. The particular way she used to listen to the small, unglamorous indignities of his days, with a patience that made them feel smaller just for having been said out loud. He did not have that anymore, but he had Zaria, and increasingly, he had noticed, she was developing the same patient way of listening, as though some part of her mother had settled into her, without either of them choosing it. Some mornings, the measure of a man is not the medal he was given, or the water he once pulled someone out of, but the quiet, steady life he chooses to build, once nobody is asking him to prove anything at all. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.